This is a tutorial in Adobe Illustrator. For our project, we're going to use Adobe Illustrator to make the parts of the sculpture that are flat. So this could be weights that you want to use that are cut out on the laser cutter, so that'll basically be cut from flat stock. Or it could be the blades that you're going to use that are going to be cut on the CNC. So anything that's going to be cut from flat stock, we need to design, and the best software to do that is Adobe Illustrator. So I've launched Adobe Illustrator. It's in your dock, and it's marked with an AI. If you're on one of the computers in the lab that the shortcuts are broken, I'm in the process of getting computer services to fix those. So in that case, you'll need to go to the Go menu, then go to the Applications folder, go to the Adobe Illustrator folder, find the icon, and launch it from the Applications folder. Once you launch it, it'll come to this screen, and basically this gives you the opportunity to start a new file. So we're just going to, or open an existing file. We're going to start a new file by hitting the Create New button. It's going to bring up a dialog box. On the right-hand side of the dialog box, you can set up particular dimensions. So in this case, for this tutorial, it doesn't really particularly matter. I'm just going to set this up 11 inches by 8.5 inches. Now, Adobe Illustrator has the ability to set up multiple documents that save together. And in the language of Illustrator, it calls those artboards. So if you wanted, let's say you're doing 4 sketches and you want those sketches to save as a single document, you could set up 4 artboards if you preferred to. Maybe just to demonstrate that, I'll set up 2 artboards. So I'll set up 2 artboards. They're going to be 11 inches by 8.5 inches. And then just for a title, I'll call this Illustrator Test. Then we'll hit Create. So that creates a new document, and as you can see, I have 2 artboards, or 2 work areas. So what you're going to do is you're going to use your sketches that you made for the project 1, right? So for the mobile project, the balance project, you're going to use your sketches as a starting point, and you're more than likely going to have some parts of your sculpture that you need to design to be cut from flat stock. So either cut on the laser cutter or cut on the computer-driven CNC router. So just in terms of the general layout of Illustrator, you're going to start with those sketches, right? You're going to start with the sketch of the parts that are going to potentially be cut from flat stock. So it could be the blades, it could be some of the weights that you're going to have on the sculpture. And starting with those sketches, you're going to create a version of them in Illustrator, and that version is going to be used to make the final parts. So in terms of the general layout of Illustrator, you're going to have your menus at the top. You're going to have your toolbar on the left. You're going to have your work area, which is this white area in the center. And then you're going to have various floating palettes. So for example, this is the layer palette, right? So palettes are areas where you have additional functionality. So the layer palette gives you the additional functionality of using multiple layers. So it's an organizational tool. The color palette, which is here, gives you the additional ability or the additional tool of, picking colors, right? I'm not going to go through all of the palettes, but we'll be talking about some of them today. This is the pathfinding palette. The pathfinding palette lets you use simple paths to make more complex paths. So if you have a palette and you don't see it, like maybe you've used it in a previous session in Illustrator, all of the palettes will be underneath the window menu. So if you look in the window menu, if something has a check mark by it, that palette is currently open. So if you look, there's a check mark by the layers palette because that palette is currently open. These other palettes that aren't open or that don't have a check mark by them are not open. So if you wanted to, you can open these by simply just clicking on them. So if I go to the Align palette, it will open up my Align palette, which is here. If I want to close a palette, we can go back to the window menu and I can click Align and it will close that palette. We do need the layers palette, the pathfinding palette open. So I'm going to go back to Windows and I'm going to go to Pathfinder and let's open that palette back up. So you're going to start with your sketch. And then using your sketch as a guide, you're going to begin to build the shapes that you need. And of course, this is going to vary from student to student depending upon your design. But let's go over basically how to make simple shapes, and then we'll go over how to use some of the tools to make more complex shapes. So in your toolbar, you have a tool in the first column that's 5 tools down, and that particular tool will let you make simple shapes. Now, as a general rule, if one of the tools has a little triangle in the bottom right-hand corner, and most of them do, there are some exceptions, but most of them have this little triangle, that is a flyout menu. And if you click on that tool, this tool is the rectangle tool, the rounded rectangle tool, the ellipse tool, the polygon tool, the star tool, and the flare tool. So it's actually multiple tools. So if we start with the rectangle tool, and I set a foreground and background color, so here in your toolbar, near the bottom of the toolbar, you have a chip that's white. In my case, yours may be a different color because it can be customized. And then behind it, you have a border, a square that's a border that is black in my case. So what that represents, the one on top represents the fill color, and the black one that's a simple border represents the stroke color. So let's change those. You can alter those by double clicking the chip. That will bring up the color picker. And let's say that I want this to be red. So I'll pick red and I'll hit OK. Notice that my color changed. Let's say I wanted to change the stroke. Double click on the stroke. It'll bring up your color picker. And maybe I change the stroke just for the sake of demonstration to blue. And if I hit OK, my stroke color is now blue and my fill color is red. So if I come out into my work area, I have the rectangle tool. To draw a rectangle, you just simply drag while holding your mouse and release, and it will make a rectangle. If you want to make a square, hold the Shift key while performing that same action. So hold Shift, drag and release, and that constrains the height and the width to the same proportion, right? And when you release the mouse, you get a perfect square. Let's go to the flyout for that tool, and let's go to the rounded rectangle tool, which is the second tool. So this is essentially the same tool as the rectangle tool, with the exception that it will give you rounded corners. So if I drag with that tool, it'll give me rounded corners, right? And I can make a rectangle with rounded corners. Or if I hold Shift while dragging, I can make a square with rounded corners. I'm going to go ahead and clean up my work area here. So if you select something, you can select it by clicking on it. And if you want to select multiple things, you can hold Shift and click. So I'm going to Shift click these 4 shapes, hit delete on my keyboard, and it will delete those shapes. Let's go back to the 5th tool in the first column and go to the flyout, and let's go to the 3rd tool that's in that menu. That's the ellipse tool. So the ellipse, I drag, and release, and it will make an elliptical shape or an oval. If I want to make a circle, you guessed it, hold shift, that will constrain the proportions, and I can make a perfect circle. If I go to the next tool, that's the polygon tool. So the polygon tool will make a polygon. If you want to change the number of sides on the polygon, you can get the tool, move out into space, and instead of just dragging immediately, double click, and it will open up this little dialog box. And by default, it's set to 6 sides. But let's say that I wanted it to have, 5 sides. I can hit OK, and then that polygon has 5 sides. Or if I double click again, I can make it have 3 sides. And then I can change the radius. So maybe I change the radius to 2, so it'll be a little bit larger. If I hit OK, then it is a 3-sided polygon, which obviously is a triangle. Now this will stay in the last setting that someone set it to. So if I now drag with my tool, it's going to be a triangle until I double click and reset the number of sides. So I can set this to a 16-sided polygon. If I hit OK, now that's going to approach a circle, right? Let's clean up this work area again. So holding shift, I'm going to click on the various different shapes and then hit delete on the keyboard. If I go back to my tool, the next tool is the star tool. So the star tool draws stars, and similar to the polygon tool, if you want to change the number of sides, double click in your work area. It'll bring up this little dialog box, and I can change this to an 8-pointed star. I can change the 2 radiuses. Now it has 2 radiuses because one radius controls where the outer points are located, and then the second radius controls where the inner points are located. So if you make these 2 numbers really different, you'll get a really spiky star. So for example, I can do that. I can make it 3 by 0.5. And so I'll have a star that's got really big spikes, and you'll see that that's the case. So it'll look like that. If you want it to have subtler spikes, then make these numbers closer together. So if I do 0.5 and 0.75, and I hit OK, I'll get a star that's got, not as much difference between where those 2 radiuses are. So that basically translates into the spiky parts of the star not being as long. So let me shift click these shapes, and we'll delete them by hitting delete on the keyboard. So that's making simple shapes using the 5th tool, which is the shape tool. I'm going to skip the flare tool for today. It's useful, but not for our project, I don't think. So let's say that you needed to make a more complex shape than those simple shapes. So to make a more complex shape, let's say that I wanted to make a shape that looks like 2 circles that are conjoined. So I can draw a circle. I'm going to hold the shift key to do that. And then I can draw a second circle. So again, hold the shift key. Get the first tool in the first column, which is the move tool. So that lets me click on something and move it into a different position. Notice those pink lines that appear. That pink line are my smart guides. And the smart guides give you information about alignment. In this case, that pink line is showing me the alignment of the center of these 2 shapes. Okay, so if I do that, I have 2 shapes that visually are sitting on top of each other, but they're not actually a single complex shape. So to make that a single complex shape, we're going to use our pathfinding tools. Now, Illustrator gives you multiple ways to do this task, but today I'm going to go over the pathfinding tools. If you know some other way, obviously feel free to use it, but I'm not going to cover other methods today. So to join these, you select the 2 shapes by holding shift, Come up to your pathfinding menu. Now again, if this isn't available, I'm going to pull this down so we can see it a little better. If this isn't available, you can find this underneath the window menu and go down to Pathfinder alphabetically. So it's right there. So this first tool underneath the shape modes, that little icon is trying to show you that that's going to combine two things. So it's the unite tool. And so with two shapes selected, if I click that, it's going to unite them into a single shape. So if I deselect the shape by clicking in the negative space, right, and I reselect the shape, you can see that it only has one bounding box. It's a single shape now instead of being two shapes. Incidentally, if you want to undo something, you can do Command Z and it will undo the last thing that you did. So just to show you this so we can compare, I just made another copy and I'm going to join this copy. If you look at this, the one on the right is a single shape because it united those two shapes. The one on the left is still two shapes, right? And I could inadvertently move them off of one another. They're not actually joined. So that's how to join two shapes. What if I wanted to use one shape to cut a shape out of the other? So you can do that with the second tool that's underneath the shape modes in the pathfinding tool. So to do that, you get the two shapes you want to use. So in this case, I'm going to use the smaller circle. And let me change its color just so we can kind of see a little better. I'll just make it a darker color. So I'm going to use the black circle to cut a piece, almost like a cookie cutter, out of the larger circle. So to do that, you arrange them the way that you want them. And then you hold Shift and select both of them. And then you click the second button. It actually gave me the opposite of what I wanted because it's always going to use the shape on top to cut the shape that's underneath. So let's undo that, Command Z. So to switch the order of these shapes, select the black shape because I want to bring it to the top. Come to your object menu and go to the option Arrange, which is the second option. This option lets you arrange the stacking order of shapes that are in a single layer. So I'm going to bring the shape to the front. So your options are bring to front, bring forward, bring backwards, and bring to back, or send to back. So bring to front will bring something all the way on top of every other object that's in that layer. Bring forward will bring something just one object forward. Send backwards sends something just one object back, and send to back sends it all the way behind every object that's in that layer. So if I go to bring to front, it brings that black circle to the top. And now if I select both of those circles and I use the second tool, that's called the minus front tool, by the way, it will basically give me what I was going for, which is kind of, maybe a cookie with a bite out of it, right? So that's a way that you can make more complex shapes using simple shapes. Maybe what I'm making is, kind of like an axe handle or something. So let me undo this. I'm going to copy this black circle. Now you can do that by selecting it and going to Edit and going to Copy, and then going to Edit and going to Paste. And I can align that to this side. And so I could cut with this twice, right? So select these two and cut once. Bring this other black circle to the top by selecting it and going to the object menu and going to Arrange and bring to front, and then shift click the two shapes and then click that minus front button again. So I'd end up with something like that. And if I created a handle to go with this, so I'm going to make my handle a different color. You can imagine that this could kind of look like an axe, right? So I could do a quick illustration of an axe. Let's say that I wanted to make a shape that looked like a football. I could get two circles or two ellipses. Or maybe I'm making an eyeball. So I could copy the shape. So select it and go to edit copy, and then go back to edit paste. And I'm going to align this so that they kind of overlap. And then select both shapes and then use the third tool. It will give me the intersection of the two shapes. So basically that's this part where they overlap. And so then I could end up from two ellipses making a shape that looks more like an eyeball. If I wanted to give it a pupil, you could do that. So you could give it a pupil. I need a copy of this. I just used the shortcuts to make the copy. So the shortcuts are Command C to copy and Command V, as in victory, to paste. And let's get a circle for the pupil. I'm going to change the color of this just so we can see it a little better. So I'll make it black. And I can position it. I actually didn't make that big enough, so let me scale this a little bit. You can scale by pulling from one of the corners while holding Shift to keep it proportionate. So if I do the overlap of these two shapes, maybe I'll scale this just a little bit more. So hold Shift and pull from the corner. So again, I'll select both of them, use this third tool to get the intersection of the two. And then if I bring this down, let's turn that white. Well, actually, I won't be able to see white too well. Let's actually do this. Let's turn that back to, maybe I'll make it blue or something. And this red part, I mean, that looks pretty angry, so let's turn that to white. And I'll edit the stroke to make it a little thicker. Now you can do that over in your properties palette. So this property palette gives you information about the shape you have selected. And the information I want to change is the stroke. So the stroke is set to 1, and I'm going to make that a little thicker by increasing the number. So maybe I'll set it to 5. So if we now just add one more circle, you know, just like that, without a ton of work, you could make an illustration of an eyeball, right? Oh, I could work on that further, but for, you know, a pretty quick illustration, that's not too bad. Okay, so then finally, this fourth tool, what it does is it gives you the opposite of the intersection. So if I have, let's say, a rectangle, and then let me change the color just so we can see this better. If I then create another shape, let's say I'll use a circle on top of that. Let's go like that maybe. Well, maybe that. We'll do that. Okay, so what that'll do is it won't give me where they overlap. It'll give me where they don't overlap. Okay, so if I select both of them, click this fourth button, which is the exclude button, then it gives me that. Now, what that looks like is it looks like it you know, it changed this to white, but it didn't change it to white. If I put this on top of my eyeball, you can see that you can see through it. It changed it to transparent, you know? So it keeps the parts that aren't overlapping, and it eliminates the part that is overlapping. So those are the first 4 tools in the pathfinding palette, and that gives you some tools to experiment with to make more complex shapes. The next thing that I want to go over is the pen tool. So in your tool palette, it's the third tool. Now be aware that it may be set to a different tool because there's, you know, various different tools here. So you have the pen tool, the add anchor tool, the delete anchor tool, and then the anchor point tool. So the pen tool is a good tool to learn how to use. It's a little tricky at first, but once you learn the pen tool, you basically learn the pen tool for pretty much every Adobe product. So the way that the pen tool works, it works in conjunction with your stroke. So I need to set my stroke. So I'm going to set my stroke to black. Set my stroke to black. And then I'm going to set my fill to nothing. So underneath your fill, if you bring it to the front by clicking on it, that tells the computer that you're editing the fill. And if I hit this little slash mark, it'll give the object that I make no fill. So it'll only have a stroke. So to make a straight line, you click a point, you move out in the direction that you want the line, and you click a second point. If you want to make another point, come down, click a third point, and it makes another point. So to make straight lines, it's just a process of moving and clicking. If you want a diagonal point, you can do diagonals as well. If I want to close this form, come back to the first point that I set, put my pen icon right over that first point. Notice that a little circle appears by the pen icon. That's telling me it's going to close that form. And when I click, I now have this complex polygon. And just to show you, we could fill that. Like maybe I fill it green. Okay, so you could use the pen tool to make complex shapes. What if you want to make complex curved shapes? Well, no, this is where the pen tool gets a little trickier. Actually, before I move on to that, let's talk about this direct selection tool. So the black arrow, which is in the first column, lets you select an object and move it, right? Just click and drag. The white arrow, which is in the second column, is the direct selection tool. And what that allows you to do is to select a point that's making up an object. So this object is made up of a point at each of these corners, right? We just set those points using the pen tool. Well, if I decided I didn't want one of these points to be in the exact position that I set it the first time, I can edit this by clicking back on the point with the white selection tool, which is the direct selection tool, and then dragging and releasing. So I can reshape that object. Or if maybe I want this point to drag out and be pointier. So I can click the little handle, drag it out, and now I have like a pointier shape there. So any of these can be reconfigured by simply clicking on them and dragging them. And you do that with the first tool in the second column, the white arrow, which is the direct selection tool. Okay, so then how do we do something that's curved? So let me delete this whole shape. So to do something that's curved, you're also going to get the pen tool. Let me take the fill away. So let's do the stroke, the slash, no smoking slash, right, to take the fill away. I'm actually going to, so let's get the pen tool. Let's come over here in our properties palette, and let's change this to maybe a 3 so you can kind of see the thickness of it better. So to make something that's curved, you click to set the first point. So that's the same as making a straight line. You move out however long you want the curve to be, and you click and hold the mouse. Don't release the mouse when you click that second time. I'm still holding the mouse. And then drag in the opposite direction that you want the curve to be. So if I want the curve to curve up, drag down. If you want the curve to be like a smile, right? You want the curve to curve down, drag up. And when you release the mouse, it will draw that curve. Now notice that you get a preview of the next curve. So that's that blue line. My actual curve is the black line. You also get this straight line with these two handles. That handle lets you manipulate or edit the curvature of that curve if you want to edit it later, right? So by default, once you make one curve, The computer has to make the second curve in one of two ways. It can either make the second curve like a hop, or it can make the second curve like an S-curve, and what it defaults to is an S-curve. So if I want to make an S-curve, just simply move my mouse to where I want the third point to be set and click again. And then I get an S-curve. So if I go back and I get the direct selection tool, which is the wide arrow tool, I can change my mind about the curvature of this path. So I do that by clicking on that center vector point. That will turn the handles on, which is that line with the two blue dots. And then by manipulating the handle, I can manipulate the curve. Right? If I push the handle in, it will flatten the curve. If I pull the handle out, it will make the curve more extreme. So by manipulating those handles, I can always go back and manipulate the curve. If I've drawn a line, I want to continue drawing the same line, and I clicked on another tool, the computer needs to know whether you're starting a new line or you're continuing the same line. If you want to continue the same line, go back and click on the last point, or the point where you want to continue, and that will tell the computer that I'm continuing that same shape. Okay, so what if in this case I don't want an S-curve, but I want a hop? Okay, so actually let me start over to do that. Let's just delete this shape. Okay, so if I click and I move out and I click and drag, all right, I'll get my first curve. Now, but by default, it's going to do an S-curve, and you see that that's the case because of the preview line, which is that blue line, which is showing you a preview of how it's going to do the curve. So what if I want it to hop instead of doing an S-curve? Well, to do that, you simply toggle the point by clicking on it. So I just move to the last point, the second point in this case, and I click. Notice that one of the handles went away. And then I can move out to where I want the hop to end and click and drag. And that will make a hop, right? So by default, notice it wants to make a S-curve. If I don't want the S-curve, maybe I want a third hop. Move to that last point and click it, which toggles its behavior, right? From an curved behavior to an acute behavior, right? So then if I move down, I can click and drag a third time, and it will make a hop like that. So again, if you want to close this form, move back to the first point that you started at, put your pen tool over that first point. You'll see a little circle appear by your pen tool icon, and that's letting you know that you're closing that form. And so I can close that form, and if I click and drag instead of just clicking, I can manipulate the curvature before I close that form. So I've made, I don't know exactly what that shape is. It looks kind of like maybe a paw or something. I don't know, maybe some teeth. But I've made this complex curvilinear shape. Now, similar to the first shape that we made with straight lines, I can edit this by getting the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow, the first tool in the second column. So if I go back, I can change the position of any of these points by clicking and dragging them. Or I can change the curvature of the curves by manipulating the handles. If I want to change this altogether where there's no curvature on these, well then I can get this tool. So in my little flyout for the pen tool, the fourth tool is the anchor point tool, and it converts an anchor from a curved point to a straight point. So if I were to click these curved points, you notice that's now a straight line. If I click this curved point, notice that's now a straight line. If I click this curved point, notice that's now a straight line, right? So it converts curved points to straight lines. If I wanted them to be curved again, you can click and drag on a point and it will make it curved. click and drag, and it will make it curved. So you can reconfigure that after you've made it. Now, to fully kind of finish our discussion, let's get the pen tool. Let's say I make a fairly complex shape. So I'm just going to set some points just kind of randomly. And I'm going to close this form by going back to the first point and clicking. So if I decide, oh, I have too many points on here, well, that's where in your pen tool palette, you have these 4 tools. That's where this third tool comes in. It's the one that has a nib like the pen tool, but it's got a minus sign by it. So with that tool, I can go and click on any point and it will delete that point. And so by doing that, I can simplify the shape. So if I keep doing that and I delete all of these points, I could take this all the way back to a triangle basically. So if I click all the points, I can have a triangle like that. Now let's say that I needed to add points to a path that I've already closed. Well, that's where the second tool, the one that has the plus sign, so it looks like the pen tool with the plus sign, comes in. So basically you just come to an existing point, click on it, and it will set a point, right? If you then get the direct selection tool, the white arrow tool, you can then manipulate the placement of that point by clicking and dragging. So I could set points back on this path by clicking it, and then go back and get my direct selection tool and then manipulate the placement of these points to manipulate the shape. That's basically what I have for you today. There's a lot of additional information about the pen tool and the pathfinding tools and even the primitive tools, but that should be enough to get you started.